So these next few videos are going to be talking about the decline of the Qing Dynasty in China. So it's important for us to realize that in this section, China has the most in common in terms of why it's transforming to the Ottoman Empire. The next series of videos are going to be about Japan, and we're going to see how Japan has a very different response to foreign pressures, which actually makes it emerge as an imperial power. So um, we're going to see that just like the Ottoman Empire, Western intervention is a really major contributor to the decline. We're also going to see that there was a population increase that took place in the Qing Dynasty that certainly challenged the ability for them to sustain this high population. When the Taiping Rebellion breaks out, the 20 million people that are killed, many of them actually die due to starvation and some to disease. You don't really see the military conflict of the Taiping Rebellion resulting in nearly as many fatalities. So one thing that we know is that the Qing Dynasty, like the Ming Dynasty, was not particularly interested in expanding its trade networks with the foreign world, at least at the beginning. We see that at the beginning of the Qing Dynasty, most Chinese merchants are still just buying foreign goods with gold and silver, which demonstrates that they don't really have an interest in buying, actual manufactured goods from foreign countries. So that's a big difference, actually, in many ways to the Ottomans, because we know that the Ottomans, their lack of industrialization essentially forced them to buy cheap European manufactured goods. And another example of why the Chinese are resistant to foreign trade is because the initial contacts that the Chinese had with foreigners sort of rubbed them the wrong way. So this image down here is of Lord Macartney, who was a British envoy who met with the emperor to try to negotiate more open trade privileges between Britain and Japan. If you see here, he's kneeling on one knee. Okay, that was not the way that you were supposed to greet the Chinese emperor. There was a practice called kowtow, Kowtow, which is resembled more in this image, where if you were to meet the emperor, you were supposed to bow down so far that your forehead touched the ground. So just by this simple action, just by this British man essentially refusing to honor this Chinese custom, we're going to see essentially very little interest at all in the early years of the Qing Dynasty with opening up trade. So the major difference we're going to see is that they're finally, by the late, essentially by the mid 19th century, so sort of late in the years of the Qing Dynasty, since it was formed in 1644, the British are finally going to find a commodity that the Chinese want, and that's going to be opium, which can grow relatively inexpensively, and it was a highly addictive substance. So what we're going to see is that since it was grown in great quantities in India, which was a British colony, it was pretty easy to import it into China. But before the Opium War actually begins, the Chinese emperor is aware of how addictive and dangerous opium was, so he actually forbade the importation of opium. But in the early years of this ban, it wasn't heavily enforced, so opium is continuously smuggled into China. But then, when opium addiction runs rampant, the Chinese government feels compelled to act, and they very strictly enforce the opium ban, to the point where they actually seize ships in Chinese ports that are carrying opium. Now, this is going to enrage the British. They feel that by banning opium explicitly and actually taking their cargo, it violates their trade privileges. So the British are going to respond by invading China with the First Opium War in 1839 to 1842. And then we're later going to see that there's going to be a second Opium War in the 1850s, which is only going to weaken the Chinese influence abroad. So the British Navy is, it's still at this point, ever since the Spanish Armada, it's the most powerful navy in the entire world. And the Chinese Navy doesn't really exist. So the British are going to very easily defeat the Chinese in the First Opium War. And the treaty that ends the war was called the Treaty of Nanking. And we see that China makes some major concessions to foreign powers, and that they open up 4 additional ports. Before this treaty, the only port that was open to foreigners was Canton, or we call it Guangzhou today. But now we're going to have 4 more ports. And in each of these trading ports, the British are going to be given extraterritoriality rights, which basically means that they follow their own laws. They're not actually subject to the Chinese laws. And then, additionally, Hong Kong is going to become a British colony, and it's going to remain in the hands of the British until 1997. So we get a sense of continuity there, and how long this really changes the strength of China. Okay, and then, as I mentioned, I mean, the Second Opium War is essentially just, making it even more difficult for the Chinese to have sovereignty. And that in addition to those 4 ports that were open after the Treaty of Nanking, we're going to have 80 more ports get open up to foreigners. So essentially, this is really the beginning of the end for the autonomy of the Qing Dynasty. All right, so after that, we're going to see that gradually, because of the British example, other countries in Europe that are already increasing their imperial influence abroad are going to also try to seek favorable trade privileges in China. So what we're going to see is that on a gradual basis, other European countries are going to start to gain what we call spheres of influence in different parts of China. So a sphere of influence basically was an area that guaranteed specific trading privileges for whichever nation held on to that sphere. So if we look at this map over here, we can see that Britain definitely has the largest sphere of influence, both controlling the western province of Tibet and also controlling essentially the entire Yangtze River Valley here. But the Japanese are an interesting case as well, because they, at this point, were still seen as a sort of a backward, barbaric nation to Westerners. But after the Russo-Japanese War that ends in 1905, the Japanese are quickly going to respond to foreign pressures by actually playing the game of imperialism themselves. There's going to also be a limited German influence in the port of Guangdong up here. And then also you're going to see that there's going to be a French influence in southern China. And this map doesn't show this, but the French influence also extends into Vietnam, which is called French Indochina. All right, so there are other internal problems that contribute to China's decline. So we'll talk about the Taiping Rebellion, and then we'll start with a new video on reforms. Okay, so after the Opium War, you're going to see that there's a lot of bitterness among the Chinese against the foreigners who they are calling foreign devils, right? They're also really upset with the Qing emperor because if you remember, the Qing Dynasty was established by Manchus, so people who were not Han Chinese. They were from north of China. So essentially, you still have this tension that exists between the Han Chinese who wish to restore the Ming Dynasty and then the Manchus who are largely ruling the country. You're also going to have a major resentment of Christian missionaries as well as Chinese converts to Christianity in China. One of the major ones, and he's going to be the leader of the Taiping Rebellion, Hong Xiuquan. He actually was an exception to the rule because he did convert to Christianity. He actually thought that God wanted him to overthrow the Qing Dynasty and create a new Christian kingdom in Asia. So there's going to be a difference in terms of who all of the rebels actually hate. But so some of them hate outside Christians, some of them don't. But still, overall, they're all upset with Qing rule, okay, and their ability to handle the foreign presence. So Hong Xiuquan is going to be the leader of the Taiping Rebellion, and he's going to get together other people who resent the Qing emperor, largely peasants and workers. And they are going to attempt to overthrow all of China. They successfully capture Nanking, which is a major city. And then they do start their advance on Beijing, the capital, as well as Shanghai to the south. So there was a major threat on the Qing government during this period. When the Qings when the Taiping rebels gained strength, they already were establishing plans for what they thought the government they would establish would be. And so they were calling on getting rid of some Chinese traditions like ancestor worship and foot binding. And they're very upset with the emperor for granting extraterritoriality rights to foreigners. So if the Taiping Rebellion had been successful, we might have definitely seen a decreased foreign influence in China. But what the Qing government does is it knows, since the Taiping rebels were upset with outsiders, the Qing actually gets the assistance of a foreign military presence, mostly British and French, and they are going to successfully put down the Taiping Rebellion before they can successfully seize Beijing. The result of the Taiping Rebellion was major fatalities. You're going to have 20 million people die in all, but as I mentioned earlier, it's not only military death that we're talking about. Because a lot of this rebellion was enacted by peasants in particular, you're going to have a decrease in agricultural production, and that, coupled with the population increase that we experienced up to this point, means many people are going to starve. And then also there's going to be a plague that breaks out in China during the Taiping Rebellion, which is, of course, going to kill other millions of people. So the result, and then one other thing, the Yellow River actually changed course during the Taiping Rebellion. So you're going to have some provinces suffer from major floods, and then you're going to have other provinces suffer major droughts. So all of this is going to result in many more deaths. And in addition to the 20 million people that we know of that died, 70 million more people were displaced. And that's out of a total population of 400 million. So this is a major, it's wiping out like 1/4 of the Chinese population. We're going to see that one of the other results of this, which we'll talk about in a future video, is that there's going to be a major Chinese diaspora. And the population is going to start branching out to many other parts of the world, including the US. So that is going to be the end of this first video. We're going to pick up with some reform efforts in China with the next video, so stay tuned for that one.